On September 2, 2003, Alan Scott Johnson and Diane Johnson were shot to death in their Bellevue, Idaho home. Their daughter, Sarah Johnson, was found guilty of their murder. Sarah was 16 years old at the time. Her motive was her parents prohibiting her from dating a 19-year-old. At approximately 6:20 a.m., Johnson took the murder weapon, a Winchester rifle from the guest house, walked into her parents' bedroom and then shot her sleeping mother in the head. She then walked into the bathroom where her father was taking a shower, and shot him in the chest, right above the heart. Johnson was found guilty of the murders of her parents on March 16, 2005. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms plus 15 years for a firearm enhancement. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld her conviction. Jonathan Eddington is a Fairfield, Connecticut patent lawyer who achieved national notoriety when, on August 28, 2006, he murdered his neighbor, Barry James, after being told that James had molested Eddington's 2-year-old daughter. There has been no evidence found that Barry James molested Eddington's daughter or anyone else. Eddington went next door to 101 Colony Street in Fairfield, where he found Barry James, 59, and stabbed him 13 times in the heart, chest, and hand. He died about an hour later at Bridgeport Hospital. On August 30, Eddington was released on $1 million bond. It was widely expected that Eddington would attempt to mount a psychiatric defense at his murder trial. Eddington instead pled guilty to the crime and was sentenced to 12 years in prison on August 31, 2007. Robert Garrow murdered 4 people in July 1973, including a young woman and a camper in the Adirondacks a few days later. Spurring on a statewide manhunt, Garrow was tracked down and shot in the foot, arm, and back by a conservation officer. He survived but alleged that he was partially paralyzed. Garrow was treated at CVPH Medical Center in Plattsburgh where doctors denied his claims of paralysis. Garrow pleaded insanity but the jury rejected it and found him guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to a term of 25 years to life in prison. Garrow escaped from the Fishkill prison on September 8, 1978. He was in possession of a .32 caliber pistol. Garrow was spotted by guards 3 days later a few hundred yards away from the prison walls and shot at his pursuers, but was killed when they returned fire. 16-year-old Lori Show inadvertently became entangled in the lives of Lisa Michelle Lambert and her boyfriend, Lawrence Yunkin. Lambert initially befriended Show, but after Yunkin allegedly assaulted Show, Lambert became very jealous and enraged. Convinced Show was pursuing Yunkin, Lambert began a campaign of harassment, stalking Show, often with the assistance of friends. On December 20, 1991, Lori Show was murdered in her home by Lambert and Lambert's friend, Tabitha Buck. Show's mother found her corpse. Lambert, Yunkin, and Buck were quickly arrested. Yunkin pled guilty and testified against Lambert in exchange for a reduced sentence of 20 years. Eventually, Lambert and Buck were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Donald Wallace admitted that after burglarizing a home, he decided to break into the house next door. However, when he did so, he was surprised to find the family inside. Patrick and Teresa Gilligan and their 2 children, aged 4 and 5, were confronted by Wallace. All 4 were tied up and killed. He killed Mr. Gilligan because he was giving him trouble. He killed Mrs. Gilligan because she was screaming and he had to shut her up. And he killed the others because he could not let the children grow up without parents. Wallace was found incompetent and confined in a mental hospital for almost 2 years prior to trial. His IQ was measured at 130. Before his execution, Wallace admitted that he had faked mental illness, and that he had in fact committed the murders. He was executed by lethal injection in Indiana on March 10, 2005. Graham Frederick Young, also known as the St. Albans Poisoner, was an English serial killer who killed his victims via poison. Obsessed with poisons from an early age, Young started poisoning the food and drink of relatives and school friends. He was caught when his teacher became suspicious and contacted the police. Young pleaded guilty to 3 non-fatal poisonings and at age 14, was detained at Broadmoor Hospital. Young later took responsibility for the death of his stepmother. Though this has not been proven, Young got a job in a factory in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, where he began poisoning his colleagues, resulting in 2 fatalities and several critical illnesses. Young was convicted on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder in 1972. He served most of his life sentence at HM Prison Parkhurst, where he died of a heart attack in 1990. At 5 p.m. on July 27, 2007, Nicola Radius was eating with his wife Yelena. After an argument, he punched her in the face and Yelena fell down. Nicola jumped into a well. By 5:30 p.m., Dragoslav Badzikic got him out of the well. A few minutes later, Nicola got his hunting rifle and walked out into the street. He then killed a number of people in the vicinity. On the street at one point, Radicevic met an older woman. He asked her in Romanian if she practiced magic. When she said no, he let her live. At 1:30 a.m. the following day, Nicola was arrested and taken to NIS hospital. He was subsequently taken to a prison mental hospital in Belgrade where he was pronounced insane. He is currently serving a lifetime sentence in the same facility. Mel Ignato was a resident of Louisville, Kentucky, who murdered his girlfriend, Brenda Sue Schaefer, in 1988. The case was controversial because Ignato was acquitted of the charge, but photographs that proved his guilt were uncovered after the trial. Under the legal principle of double jeopardy, Ignato could not be tried a second time for the murder. He was convicted and jailed for perjury in his grand jury testimony for the case on several occasions. On September 23, 1988, Ignato kidnapped Brenda and locked her in the house. Brenda was blindfolded, gagged and bound hand and foot. Ignato forced Brenda to strip before killing her with chloroform. Ignato buried her behind a house. He took Brenda's jewelry and the exposed film. Cassidy went into labor on September 19th in a bathroom at her home, took a pair of scissors to pry the baby out, and delivered the child alive and into the toilet. Cassidy lifted the moving infant from the toilet, felt for a pulse, found one, then placed her hands around the infant's neck and squeezed until he wasn't moving or breathing any longer. She took the infant's pulse again and found none. Cassidy cleaned up the bathroom, bathed herself and the dead infant before placing him in a shoebox along with soiled towels and clothing. The teen claimed she miscarried. Dr. Stephen Nelson noted there were severe head injuries consistent with the child being struck repeatedly with scissors as well as signs of strangulation. She was sentenced to 18 months in a maximum security facility for juveniles on December 19, 2012. Robert Edward Maury, known as the Tipster Killer, is an American serial killer who strangled to death at least 3 women in Shasta County, California, between 1985 and 1987. After each murder, Maury called into a tip line to tell detectives where the bodies were located. Contributing to his nickname, Maury was investigated as a suspect in September 1987 after it was suspected he had been the caller in the 3 murder cases and had received $2,000 in return. The defense argued during the trial that Maury accidentally discovered the bodies and reported them as a good Samaritan. A jury found him guilty of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to death. As of 2023, Maury is still awaiting execution at San Quentin State Prison in San Quentin, California. Marion Cottery was an Iranian serial killer who was convicted of robbing and killing 6 elderly people, 1 man in 2006, and 5 women between February and May 2009 in Kashvan. She was subsequently convicted, sentenced to death and promptly hanged in 2010. Without a source of income to pay off her amounting debts, Cottery decided that the quickest way to find money was to steal valuable items and then resell them. After picking a suitable victim, she would offer to give them a ride home, before offering a juice box laced with an anesthetic. Once the victim was paralyzed or otherwise unable to properly fight back, Cottery would proceed to strangle them using her headscarf or her bare hands. Cottery holds the distinction of being the country's first identified, and thus far only confirmed, female serial killer. 1991. Experts on sociopathic killers have long opined that some murderers get off on keeping souvenirs from their victims. John Fomalero went to the extreme. He was sentenced to death for the 1991 kidnapping and bludgeoning death of Newport Beach resident Denise Huber, 23. Fomalero kidnapped Huber after her car broke down on the Corona del Mar 73 freeway, then murdered her at a Laguna Hills warehouse. He was arrested in Arizona in 1994 after sheriff's deputies discovered Huber's body in a freezer outside his home 3 years after she was murdered. Deputy District Attorney Christopher Evans argued that Fomalero kept Huber's body as a trophy to remind him of the crime. He remains on death row. Authorities had sought a missing 10-year-old girl, Jamie Rose Bolin, for whom an Amber Alert had been issued. Kevin Ray Underwood, who lived nearby, in the same apartment complex, was arrested April 17, 2006, and Bolin's corpse, stashed in a large plastic container, was recovered from his bedroom closet. Police said in a press conference that Underwood had admitted to FBI agents and Oklahoma detectives that he had murdered and attempted to decapitate Bolin, and that he told them, "Go ahead and arrest me, she is in there, I chopped her up." Underwood was convicted of having bludgeoned Bolin to death with a wooden cutting board. Police stated that they found a meat tenderizer and barbecue skewers at the scene, which were intended for use on the victim. He was sentenced to death on April 3, 2008. Jocelyn Ortega is the nanny charged with first-degree murder for the killing of 2 young children, Lucia and Leo Krim, in New York City on October 25, 2012. The children's mother, Marina Krim, walked into her Upper West Side apartment and saw Ms. Ortega stabbing herself in the throat with the same bloody kitchen knife she had already used on the children, who lay dead in a bathtub. Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly said, Ms. Ortega, 50, survived, but was in a medically induced coma in a hospital for a week. On November 3, during an interview with detectives from her hospital bed, she said she had resentment toward the family, who she complained were always telling her what to do. A law enforcement official said, Jocelyn Ortega was sentenced to life in prison. Hal Donaldson III is a serial killer who was convicted of the 2017 murders of 3 men and 1 woman around Seminole Heights in Tampa, Florida. All 4 victims were murdered at random. Prior to his arrest, the media called him the Tampa Bay serial killer. Police charged Donaldson with 4 counts of murder. Donaldson was indicted on the charges on December 7, 2017. He pled not guilty to all charges 5 days later. On January 23, 2018, Hillsborough State Attorney Andrew Warren announced his office would seek the death penalty against Donaldson. Donaldson's trial was set for August 2023. On May 1, 2023, Donaldson pled guilty in the murders and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. Nicos Mataxis is a Greek Cypriot serial killer, known as the Cyprus serial killer, Orestes, and the Metzler murders. Mataxis confessed to killing 7 foreign national women and young girls in Cyprus between 2016 and 2018. He worked as a captain in the Cypriot National Guard. He met his victims on online dating sites, killing 5 women victims as well as killing 2 of the victims' daughters. Over a 3-year period, Mataxis stuffed some of his victims' bodies in suitcases, sinking them in nearby lakes, wells, and mine shafts. He is also accused of the assault of a teenage girl between 2016 and 2017. The victim survived the attack and came forward to file a complaint after his arrest. Nicos Mataxis was arrested on April 18, 2019. Peter Howard Moore is a British serial killer who managed cinemas in Badgilt, Holyhead, Kinmel Bay, and Denbigh in North Wales at the time of his arrest. He murdered 4 men in 1995, using a knife during his attacks. The bodies were found near small rural towns. Due to his attire when committing his attacks, he was also called the Man in Black. He also committed 39 assaults on men prior to his arrest. During his trial, Moore told the jury the crimes were committed by a fictitious lover he nicknamed Jason, after the killer in the Friday the 13th horror films. The jury found him guilty on all counts. Moore was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1996. Peter Moore became friends with fellow serial killer Harold Shipman while they were both serving time at Wakefield Prison. On November 4, 1997, Christina Riggs obtained the antidepressant Elaval from the hospital where she worked. Riggs gave the children a small amount of Elaval to put them to sleep, then she placed each of the children in their beds. About 10 p.m., she injected 5-year-old Justin with undiluted potassium chloride. She then smothered the boy with a pillow, moving to her 2-year-old Shelby. Riggs passed on the potassium chloride injection because of the pain it had caused Justin. She suffocated her daughter with a pillow. During the penalty phase, Riggs would not allow attorneys to put on a defense, saying she wanted a death sentence. Riggs was the 5th woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. She was executed by lethal injection in Arkansas on May 2, 2000. On January 31, 1994, Edgar Tamayo Arias killed police officer Guy Gaddis outside of a nightclub in southwest Houston. Gaddis apprehended Tamayo. Tamayo had a hidden weapon and used it to kill Gaddis. The police officer had 2 bullets in the head and 1 in the neck. During the arrest, police did not inform Tamayo that he could contact the Mexican consulate. 10 days before the trial began, the Mexican government was notified of the case. After an international court ruled in 2004 that any prisoner who had his or her rights to contact a consulate should have a hearing. The Office of the Attorney General of Texas stated that Tamayo opted not to have such a review. Ultimately, Tamayo was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 46 at the time of his death. Jeffrey Robert Mcdonald is an American former United States Army captain who was convicted in August 1979 of murdering his pregnant wife and 2 daughters in February 1970. While serving as an Army Special Forces physician, McDonald has always proclaimed his innocence of the murders, which he claims were committed by 4 intruders, 3 male and 1 female, who had entered the unlocked rear door of his apartment at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and attacked him, his wife, and his children with instruments such as knives, clubs, and ice picks. Prosecutors and appellate courts have pointed to strong physical evidence attesting to his guilt. He is currently incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. The case remains one of the most litigated murder cases in American criminal history. Ira Samuel Einhorn, known as the Unicorn Killer, was an American convicted murderer and environmental activist. He was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, Holly Maddox, on September 9, 1977. Maddox disappeared following a trip to collect her belongings from the apartment she and Einhorn had shared in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 18 months later, police found her partially decomposed body in a trunk in Einhorn's closet. After his arrest, Einhorn fled the country and spent 23 years in Europe before being extradited to the United States. He took the stand claiming his ex-girlfriend had been killed by CIA agents who had framed him for the crime because he knew too much about the agency's paranormal military research. He was convicted and served a life sentence until his death in prison on April 3, 2020. May 1, 2009, in Farmington, New Mexico, USA, a 21-year-old Najiza woman accused of beating another woman to death in a fight over a boyfriend. After police identified the body, detectives linked Ignacio to the crime through a Crime Stoppers tip, has pleaded to second-degree murder. Patricia Ignacio initially was charged with an open charge of murder in the death of 40-year-old Irene Armenta of Lake Valley in November 2008. She entered an Alford plea to the second-degree murder charge. An Alford plea means a defendant does not admit guilt, but acknowledges prosecutors might have enough evidence to be convicted. Armenta's body was found on November 25, partially buried by sand and broken cement in an undeveloped area of Farmington. Louis H. F. Wagner died June 25, 1875. He was a German-born fisherman who arrived in the United States around 1865. 8 years later, he was accused of the axe murders of two Norwegian women, Anithi Matea Christensen and Karen Christensen, on Smutty Nose Island, in the Isles of Shoals of Maine and New Hampshire. Later convicted of the March 6, 1875 murders, he was sentenced to be hanged. After a failed escape attempt, Wagner became the fourth to last person to be executed by the state of Maine. Despite an aggressively prosecuted case, so vehement was his denial that doubts still remain as to his guilt. The murder house on Smutty Nose Island is long gone, ravaged by 19th-century souvenir hunters who literally carried away blood-spattered bits of wall and floorboard. K.P. Undone, infamously known as Ripper Undone, is a serial killer from Trichur, who is accused of 7 murders, committed during a span of 35 robberies, in and around Trichur, Ernakulam border areas. For the 7 murders committed by Undone, including the double murder at Paranjanam in October 2004, where Undone had assassinated the inmates of the house, Kalapurakal Sahadevan, and his wife Nirmala, to steal 11.25 sovereigns of gold. Thrissur Principal Sessions Judge sentenced him to death by hanging in June 2008. He was sent to Pujapura Central Jail, where he was awaiting his execution until June 2013 when he made a daring escape. He was captured on September 9 near Trichur. He claims he was framed by the police. Otis Elwood Toole was an American serial killer who was convicted of 6 counts of murder. Like his companion Henry Lee Lucas, Toole made confessions which resulted in murder convictions, and which he later recanted. The discrediting of the case against Lucas for crimes for which Toole had offered corroborating statements created doubts as to whether either was a genuine serial killer or, as Hugh Ainsworth suggested, both were merely compliant interviewees whom police used to clear unsolved murders from the books. Toole received 2 death sentences. They were commuted to life imprisonment. He died in his cell from cirrhosis, at age 49. Police attributed the 1981 murder of Adam Walsh to Toole on the basis of recanted statements. Lucas had backed Toole's confession to the Walsh murder, claiming that he had been in possession of the victim's severed head. Henry Lee Lucas, also known as the Confession Killer, was an American convicted serial killer. Lucas was convicted of murdering his mother in 1960 and 2 others in 1983. He rose to infamy while incarcerated for these crimes when he falsely confessed to approximately 600 other murders. Many unsolved cases were closed based on the confessions and the murders officially attributed to Lucas. He was convicted of murdering 11 people and condemned to death for a single case with a then unidentified victim, later identified as Deborah Jackson. An investigation by the Dallas Times-Herald newspaper showed that many of the murders Lucas confessed to were impossible for him to have committed. On March 13, 2001, Lucas died in prison from heart failure, aged 64. He was buried at the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Huntsville, Texas. Retesting of DNA evidence has led law enforcement authorities to tie a former suspect and convicted murder to a 1984 triple homicide in southeast Iowa. The special agent in charge with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation said that the evidence recovered from one of the victims matched a previously developed DNA profile of Andrew Wessel 6. 6 was convicted of a separate murder of a girl from the Ottumwa area and executed by lethal injection in Missouri in 1997. The information stems from the triple homicide where all 3 people died of blunt force trauma and were discovered within a few days of each other in April of 1984. Police have indicated all 3 were beaten to death with a blunt object. Police tried to talk to 6 about the murders before his execution, but he was uncooperative. Police feel confident that Mr. 6 was responsible for it. Sipho Tlale is a South African serial killer known as the Phoenix Strangler. Tlale was convicted for 10 assaults and the murders of 16 women. Tlale's nickname came from the area in which he committed his crimes, Phoenix, an Indian township in South Africa. Tlale offered victims employment and was described as charming. He spoke English, Afrikaans, and Zulu. Tlale would lure women into sugarcane fields near Phoenix with the promise of employment as domestic workers in nearby hotels. Then, he would bind, beat, and assault them, prior to strangling them. He also set fire to the field and the body of a victim in hopes of destroying evidence. On March 31, 1999, the High Court in Durban found Tlale guilty of 16 murders and 10 assaults, and sentenced him to 506 years in prison. On October 25, 2002, Linda Henning was found guilty of first-degree murder and of kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and 4 counts of perjury. Gerla Chu Hasenkopf was reported missing by co-workers at an Albuquerque bank. She had told co-workers that she was involved in a separation from her husband and that if she did not show up for work they should expect the worst. Linda faced the death penalty. Linda Henning's sentencing was held on April 18, 2003. Before her sentencing date, Linda Henning had made statements that she had actually consumed the flesh of Gerla Chu Hasenkopf, and that her remains and body would never be recovered by authorities. Despite the allegation, Linda was not given a death sentence. Instead, she was sentenced to 73 years in prison. Henry Landrieu would seduce the women who came to his Parisian villa and, after he was given access to their assets, he would kill them and burn their dismembered bodies in his oven. Between 1914 and 1918, Landrieu claimed 11 victims, 10 women plus the teenaged son of one of his victims. With no bodies, the victims were just listed as missing, and it was virtually impossible for the police to know what had happened to them as Landrieu used a wide variety of aliases in his schemes. His aliases were so numerous that he had to keep a ledger listing all the women with whom he corresponded and which particular identity he used for each woman. Landrieu stood trial on 11 counts of murder in November 1921. He was convicted on all counts, sentenced to death, and guillotined 3 months later in Versailles. She claimed her husband abused her. She plotted for him to be ambushed on his way to work, but a King County judge didn't buy Velma Ogden Whitehead's tearful story, his words stinging and stern. He scolded her for playing the part of a grieving widow. Domestic violence victims deserve our compassion and resources, but the domestic violence victim is not you, Judge Stephen Gonzalez told the gray-haired Des Moines woman. Your claims of abuse and suffering, I must say, are hollow. Ogden Whitehead, 50, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the 2005 death of her husband, Ronald Whitehead, who was shot 4 times near Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and shoved from his car. She admitted helping her teenage son and his friend commit the murder. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison on June 5, 2008. Magnus Gaffgen is a German murderer. In 2002, he was arrested for the murder of Jacob von Metzler, the son of famous Frankfurt banker. On September 27, 2002, he kidnapped Jacob von Metzler in order to blackmail his parents, but killed him in his apartment. Gaffgen then demanded €1 million in ransom from the Metzler family. He was observed by the police when he picked up the ransom. After a few hours, during which he had booked a holiday and not released his victim, who was already dead, he was arrested. After being threatened with torture, as ordered by Frankfurt Police Vice President Wolfgang Daschner, he confessed and told where the body was hidden. The following year, Gaffgen was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. July 4, 2003, Sincere Understanding Allah, 14 months, drowned after his mother, Naomi Gaines, threw him off the Wabasha Street Bridge during 4th of July festivities at the Taste of Minnesota. Sincere's twin brother, Supreme Knowledge Allah, survived also being thrown into the Mississippi River. Gaines also jumped into the water and was rescued along with Supreme Knowledge by onlookers at the festival. Sincere could not be found until boaters spotted his body downriver 2 days later. She told police she and the twins would be better off dead. Gaines also has 2 children ages 7 and 3, who were out of town with relatives at the time of the incident. She was later sentenced to 19 years for Sincere Understanding's murder and 14 years for the attempted murder of Supreme Knowledge. On January 25, 1993, Mir Imal Kansi parked his pickup truck near CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia during the morning rush hour and began methodically firing into cars at a stoplight. 2 people were killed and 3 wounded before he got back into his truck and left the scene unhindered. CIA employees Frank Darling, 28, and Lansing Bennett, 66, died. 3 other people, Nicholas Starr, Calvin Morgan, and Stephen Williams, 2 who worked with the CIA and a telephone company employee, were wounded in Kansi's rampage. He fired 11 shots into 5 cars. He flew to Pakistan the next day but was arrested 4 years later, convicted and sentenced to die. He was executed by lethal injection in Virginia on November 14, 2002. Melissa Todorovic was convicted of first-degree murder in 2009 for ordering her then-boyfriend, David Bagshaw, to kill 14-year-old Stephanie Rangel. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Todorovic was able to apply for parole after 7 years. Rangel had become the focus of Todorovic's jealousy because she briefly dated Bagshaw years earlier. Todorovic, who was 15 at the time, repeatedly threatened to end the relationship unless Bagshaw killed Rangel, which he eventually did, by stabbing the teen multiple times on New Year's Day 2008. In 2018, Todorovic was granted 6 months of day parole, but she was brought back to prison after the board found she had become entangled in a secret love triangle. The board found she had contravened the condition of her release that required she disclose any new relationships. Eugene Walter Barrett was an American serial killer who murdered 3 women he was romantically involved with in Honolulu, Hawaii from 1959 to 1995. At his subsequent trial, Barrett claimed that he could not recall the murder as he was drunk at the time. This was contradicted by witnesses, who claimed that he said that she deserved it. Due to overwhelming evidence against him, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for the final murder. After his sentencing, Barrett was transferred to an out-of-state facility in Oklahoma, where he spent the majority of his prison sentence. He was occasionally contacted by his son's wife, who sent him photos of his grandsons. In 2003, Barrett was returned to the Halawa Correctional Facility, but fell ill, and was transferred to the Polimomi Medical Center, where he died from an undisclosed illness on November 8. Tanya Jamie Nelson, a North Carolina woman, received the death penalty on April 23, 2010, for murdering a Westminster fortune teller and her college student daughter. Jade Smith and her daughter Anita Nevio were found dead in Mrs. Smith's Little Saigon home on April 22, 2005. They died of multiple stab wounds to their faces and necks. Both also had cuts on their hands. What most baffled officers was why nearly a gallon of white paint had been poured over their heads and hands. The exact verdict was first-degree murder with special circumstances, including murder of multiple victims, murder during the commission of robbery, and murder by lying in wait. She remains incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, Madera County. Dr. Anthony Garcia is an American serial killer who was convicted of 2 separate double murders committed in 2008 and 2013 in Omaha, Nebraska. In March 2008, Dr. William Hunter arrived at his home in Dundee and found the bodies of his son and housekeeper, both of whom had been stabbed to death with knives taken from the home's kitchen. On May 14, 2013, at the home of Roger Brumbach and his wife Mary, detectives found that Roger had multiple wounds and a stab wound to his neck, and Mary had been stabbed to death with knives taken from the home's kitchen. Garcia was arrested in July of 2013 and went to trial in October of 2016. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He is currently imprisoned at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution, Tecumseh, Nebraska. Kang Ho-sun is a South Korean serial killer who was sentenced to death in 2010 for killing 10 women. The murders took place in Ansan, Gyeonggi Province. His first victim was Bae, a 45-year-old karaoke bar employee, followed by 3 murders in 2007, including a 48-year-old housewife and a 21-year-old student from Suwon. Their bodies were found in the woods. Kang was arrested by the police in 2009. He confessed to 10 murders. More victim remains have since been discovered and identified using DNA evidence. The families of the victims sued Kang for damages. Upon confessing to murdering 10 women, Kang was found guilty of murder and arson and was sentenced to death by a court in Ansan on April 22, 2009. Orville Lynn Majors was a licensed practical nurse and serial killer. He was tried for only 7 murders and convicted of 6. He was believed to have caused additional deaths between 1993 and 1995. He murdered patients who he claimed were demanding, whiny, or disproportionately adding to his workload. Majors' co-workers began noticing a correlation between the spike in deaths and when he was on duty and joked about when the next patient would die. In 1995, nursing supervisor Dawn Styra checked the time cards to see who was on duty during the deaths. She discovered that Majors was on duty for 130 of the 147 deaths. She alerted hospital officials, who called in the Indiana State Police. He was sentenced to 360 years imprisonment and died on September 24, 2017. William Gold was a German-American alleged serial killer, who allegedly murdered sailors passing through Aberdeen, Washington. He allegedly murdered for an unknown period of time and was a suspect in dozens of murders until his capture in 1910, spared from the death penalty by a request for leniency by the jury. He was sentenced to life in prison at Walla Walla State Penitentiary, where he died in 1927 from lobar pneumonia and erysipelas, complicated by dementia paralytic caused by syphilis. Recent scholarship has cast significant doubt on the veracity of the accusations against Gold. Historian Aaron Goings arguing that the numerous bodies discovered in Grays Harbor were the result of accidental deaths caused by unsafe conditions on the docks and in the timber industry, and that Gold was unjustly blamed for these deaths by influential local businessmen hoping to do away with the powerful figure in the local labor movement. Frederick Moors was an Austrian serial killer. Moors killed 8 elderly patients while employed in a nursing home in New York City. Soon after beginning to work at the nursing home, he would wear a white lab coat with a stethoscope around his neck, and insisted that the elderly residents address him as Herr Doctor. From September 1914 to January 1915, 17 residents died at the home. The administration called the police in to investigate. Moors had used arsenic and chloroform to murder at least 8 of the elderly residents. He later claimed he was putting them out of their misery. He readily admitted to the murders when questioned by police. Moors was diagnosed as a megalomaniac, and committed to an insane asylum. He later escaped and disappeared in April 1918. His skeletonized corpse was discovered in May 1923. Rodney Lynn Hal Boer is an American serial killer. He is the prime suspect in the Gypsy Hill Killings, a series of murders in San Mateo County, California, and possibly Reno, Nevada, whose killer was named the San Mateo Slasher. In March 2014, based on DNA profiling, Hal Boer was named as a person of interest in the murders. At the time of his identification, Hal Boer himself was imprisoned for 38 years in Oregon, with the exception of 2 brief periods when he had escaped. In 2018, Hal Boer was sentenced to 2 additional life sentences. Police also believe Hal Boer killed 2 other Gypsy Hill victims, but their cases are still under investigation. Hal Boer said he was surprised to be named the killer. He said he was guilty of committing the crime in Oregon but not the Gypsy Hill murders. The Connecticut River Valley Killer, also known as the Valley Killer, is the name given to an unidentified American serial killer, believed to be responsible for at least 7 murders of young women in or around Claremont, New Hampshire, and the Connecticut River Valley, between 1978 and 1988. In 1985 and 1986, the skeletal remains of 2 victims were recovered within 1,000 feet of each other, in a wooded area in Kellyville, New Hampshire. Forensic examination indicated multiple stab wounds. Between the recovery of the first and second bodies, the murders apparently stopped in 1988 after a woman survived an encounter with the killer. A lead suspect in the case, identified by the surviving victim as her assailant, died in a murder-suicide in 2005. Tsutomu Miyazaki was a Japanese serial killer and cannibal. Known as the Otaku Murderer, Miyazaki murdered 4 girls aged between 4 and 7. He mutilated the corpse of at least one of his victims, he drank the blood of at least one victim, and ate her hands. A premature birth left him with deformed hands, which were permanently fused directly to the wrists. He blamed his actions on Ratman, an alter ego who he claimed forced him to kill. Miyazaki drew pictures of Ratman during his trial. Miyazaki's father committed suicide after hearing of his son's actions. After 20 years of legal hearings, Minister of Justice Kunio Hadoyama signed his death warrant. Tsutomu Miyazaki was sentenced to death in 1997 and was executed by hanging in 2008. Juanetta Hoyt was an American female serial killer who murdered all 5 of her biological children. Hoyt claimed sudden infant death syndrome was the cause of death, and the doctors agreed. In 1994, Hoyt confessed to smothering her 5 children, a confession she later recanted. She was diagnosed with dependent and avoidant personality disorders. The reason that she gave for the murders was that the babies were crying, and she wanted to silence them. On September 11, 1995, she was sentenced to 75 years to life, 15 years for each murder, to be served consecutively. Juanetta Hoyt died in prison of natural causes, pancreatic cancer, in 1998. She was buried at Highland Cemetery in Richford, New York. Carl Eugene Watts was an American serial killer known as Coral Watts and the Sunday Morning Slasher. Watts is believed to have killed over 80 women in multiple states between 1974 and 1982. Watts' first confirmed murders took place when he was 20 years old in 1974, by kidnapping his victims from their homes and then murdering them. Most of his victims were thin, attractive, white women. In 1982 he was granted immunity from murder charges in exchange for providing information on his victims. Watts confessed to 12 murders and was sentenced to 60 years in prison on the lesser charge. Carl Eugene Watts was sentenced to life imprisonment in separate trials in Michigan in 2004 and 2007, and died of cancer a week after the 2007 sentence was handed down. Martin Dumollard was a French serial killer, known as the Maid Killer. Dumollard was arrested and charged with the deaths of 3 maids from 1855 to 1861. His modus operandi was to approach young girls, especially from Lyon, and pretend to be a master employee looking for a new servant. Dumollard offered significant emoluments for this type of job and then trained the young girls, who usually learned quickly, in the rural region of Côte-d'Ivoire de l'An. Some of these girls would later become his victims. His wife, Marianne Martinet, was found guilty of assisting him and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in a women's prison. She died in 1875 at Aubry Prison, in Haute-Marne, France. Martin Dumollard was publicly executed by guillotine in 1862. Body in the Garden Killer, Gay Oaks, is one of the country's most infamous killers. After lacing her de facto partner Doug Gardner's coffee with sleeping pills, she buried his body in the backyard of their home in Sydenham, Christchurch. Gardner was listed as a missing person until police received a tip-off 14 months later and discovered his body. Oaks, who had 4 children with Gardner, was convicted of murder in September 1994 and sentenced to life. She was released 8 years later when the parole board accepted the defense of battered women's syndrome. Gardner's sister Wendy Johnston said that the family was still very angry. She did not believe Oaks should be able to live a normal life. While in jail, Oaks wrote of Gardner's abusive and violent behavior. The book angered Gardner's family. Oaks was released in 2002. Fritz Hanke was a German serial killer, also known as Peter Jensen. Hanke murdered 4 women working as prostitutes in Hamburg, and kept the bodies in his apartment. Hanke sawed the corpses into pieces, wrapped them in plastic, and hid pieces in various places around Ottensen, including his own attic. In 1975, the apartment building where Hanke lived caught fire, and exposed a partially decomposed female torso in a plastic bag, which prompted the police to search the building. He was arrested when he arrived home from work. Hanke was sentenced to life in prison in 1975. Fritz Hanke was released from prison in 1993, and spent his last years in a nursing home, under the name of Peter Jensen until his death in 1998.